Welcome to the Knowledge Based Ninjas podcast, where Gauri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Welcome to the Knowledge Based Ninjas podcast series. Our guest today is Daniele Procida, Community and Documentation Manager at Divio AG, a cloud management platform with features that work across vendors including AWS, Azure, and on-prem infrastructures. So welcome, Daniele. How are you?
Hello, Gary. I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So let's quickly jump on to the questions now. So can you share how you initially got into documentation, please?
I think the way that many programmers did as an open source software user and contributor who found themselves a bit frustrated by the existing documentation and decided to write the documentation that they wanted to find.
Fantastic. Yeah. So it's coming from your own pain points. We should say that?
Exactly. Yes.
Fantastic. So what's your documentation process and who is normally involved in it?
Well, at Divio, we're slightly unusual in that we've treated documentation very seriously for a very long time, which is why we have a small team. And our main process actually is a mindset that we try to ensure that all of our programmers and developers, and not just developers, but other contributors in the company, feel that they have a responsibility for the documentation and a stake in it, so that everyone's work goes towards the documentation where it can.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, that's very important. And it's very important that everybody understands the importance of a good documentation as well, isn't it?
Yes, it has to come from inside. People have to believe in it.
Fantastic. So on that basis, what are the important factors that you consider when creating documentation for your SaaS business?
I think the real question is, a way of putting that is, the documentation is for our users. Who are our users? And what are they trying to do? How can we meet their needs? Because if our documentation is not meeting a user's need, then it could be useless or even worse than useless. So it has to be centered around the users of your product.
Very well said. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that kind of answers my next question. So what role does documentation have in your customer service or strategy? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question because I don't think there is a single role, but I think one of the things it does, for example, it's even before somebody becomes a customer, if they see our documentation and it shows to them that we think about our users, that we see things the way the users do, or that we try to see things the way that they do, or if we can show through our documentation thinking like users think and treating users' problems and questions seriously, then our documentation is not just helping people from a technical perspective, it's also laying a groundwork for people who are not even yet customers or users. So it's potentially even a sales tool, if you like, because it's giving something to people who don't yet have a relationship with you, but it's giving them a reason to trust you in the future.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's very well said, Daniele. Yeah.
I think that one problem people have a lot with documentation is that they read the documentation and they think, oh, these people haven't thought about me or my needs. They don't care about people like me. And then you lose them.
Yeah.
Whereas, and then, of course, the people who are already your users, good documentation helps them get done what they need to get done quickly and efficiently.
Yeah. So you're putting yourself into the shoes of your customers.
I don't think you can get away without doing that.
Yeah. So I'm sure with the level of passion you showed so far, you might have already seen a huge reduction in workload. So what can you say about that? Introducing a quality documentation.
I think the obvious answer, which everyone would expect, one is that it's in having users who can quickly find the answers that they need, and also users start to trust the documentation, and they learn that they can go there first without coming to customer service to ask for help. So that obviously helps. But then there are some additional advantages of having well-written or well-structured documentation. One is that it's much easier to maintain that documentation if it's well-structured. So the actual business of maintaining and writing documentation takes less effort if the investment has been made in the first place to get it fundamentally right. And also the same documentation that serves the customers can also serve internal users. You find that if things are documented well for your customers, then you don't have to remember them or keep reminding people. We often have the experience that I think, I need to look something up, and suddenly discover that I or a colleague has actually put it in exactly the right place in our documentation. And that saves a great deal of time, not just for yourself, but for your colleagues whom you might otherwise have to go and speak to.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So I think that again could be a direct ROI, right? So have you seen a direct ROI since adopting a self-service knowledge base? And how do you measure this normally?
Well, we use analytics on our documentation just as we use it on the rest of our platform. We see that we see the things that people look for the most and can get a good sense of what people are looking for. It's not possible to. I don't think it's really possible to measure this in one simple way, because documentation just doesn't have a single return. It's got returns that occur in lots of different ways. So to a certain extent, although we see the analytics, we see the numbers going in the right direction, there's also a qualitative feedback that we get from users, customers that is, and also internal users about how the documentation is working for them, and sometimes where things need to be improved as well. So it's not quite as simple as reading off some numbers, I don't think.
Exactly. I mean, to be really honest, whoever we have spoken to so far, the answer has pretty much been more or less the same. And when it comes to documentation, it's very difficult to measure the ROI or the immediate effect that it would have on your team members or customers, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Especially because one of the effects is that simply sometimes, for example, it means that fewer requests come into customer service, to customer support. And that's not you can't correlate it directly necessarily with documentation. So you have to use other measures to get an understanding of what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, you said putting customers in the first place is your primary importance. So are you currently generating any organic search traffic from your knowledge base?
Yes, we are. We are finding people coming to the documentation, not because they're using something on our platform, but because they've done a search for some technical question that's related to things we use in our platform, for example, Docker, and our documentation has risen to the top of the search lists. In fact, I think on Friday I was looking up something some complexity in Docker. I was trying to find the answer. I did a web search, and I was reading a document, and I thought, oh, and then I realized I was reading a page that I'd written in our own developer handbook.
Okay.
I'd forgotten that I'd written it, and I was so focused on what I was reading that I didn't even realize the website it was on. But it was the answer that I needed, and my past self had written it, and my present self was enjoying the benefit, and I didn't even know it was there, but I found it from a web search.
Fantastic, yeah. I think that takes us to this rapid fire round. So just 3 questions to fire up. So you did mention that it's all your initial days of interest in documentation came from your own pain point, but who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
Well, many years ago, I used to be a high school teacher. And I would say I learned the most about it from my 11-year-old pupils, because I discovered that way that teaching or a tutorial is absolutely nothing like giving other kinds of instruction to people. And this is something that most documentation fails to understand.
Yeah, I used to be a teacher as well in my past career, so I can relate what you're talking. So can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Sure, but do you mind if I share one that I actually wrote? Because this is something these are the principles that are behind all of our documentation. It's an article that's at divio.com/blog/documentation. And this went viral about 18 months ago.
Okay.
And to this day, it receives more traffic than every other page on our website put together.
Fantastic. Yep. Please share the link. Yeah.
So this is about how documentation should be written. And it's not about the content of the documentation. It's about the structure of documentation. And this has solved all the key documentation problems that we have had over the years. And other people have also found this to be an extremely useful analysis and system for writing documentation. I won't go into it here. We could talk another time if you like, but that's what I would like to share.
Super. So apart from this, do you have any other related resource you have consumed recently?
I enjoy the Write the Docs community, which has regular conferences. There's a Slack channel. There are technical writing conferences, and they're always good ways to meet people who have ideas and experience about documentation that have been extremely valuable to me. So I could recommend those. And it's Write the Docs, and you can find their chapters and events all over the place.
Yeah. Super. So what's the one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
Well, when I was a 20-year-old, I wasn't doing any documentation, but definitely the documentation I started writing 10 or 11 years ago, if I understood what I understand now about the structure of documentation, it would have made my life much, much easier from the start. So to understand structure and to understand that documentation isn't one thing, but is 4 different things: tutorials, how-to guides, reference material, and explanation, and that all documentation should be structured around these. That would have saved me not just hours, but probably weeks and months of my time.
Fantastic. So I'm sure that the blog that you have shared right now is going to be a huge interest to many upcoming writers. Super. So do you have any other points you would like to share with us, Daniele, today?
It's really nice to hear people talking about documentation and taking it seriously. I think it's been often been the neglected child of software development for many years. But people are starting to realize that whatever it is you're working on, for whether it's a hobby project or an extremely large platform with thousands of users, if your documentation isn't good enough, then it doesn't matter how good the project is. People are going to be turned away from it and will be less successful with it. So seeing documentation receive the respect that it's due is very pleasing.
That's very true. And also it could help your technical support reduce gradually. And, as you rightly said, the whole customer experience with your team, your company, your product will hugely improve.
Definitely. There's a lot to be gained from actually not a minimal investment, but a modest investment that gives a lot back.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Gauri.
Thank you once again for your time in Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast series. It was an absolute pleasure connecting with you and learning your journey in creating documentation for your company. So good luck, and I wish you a very prosperous 2020.
And the same to you.
Thank you. Take care, Daniel. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.